You're listening to Soundside. I'm Gabriel Spitzer in for Libby Dankman. When you buy a fruit or a vegetable or a carton of almond milk, you might assume that it's an animal-free product. But all of those foods and many more rely on one small but mighty member of the animal kingdom, the bee. Bees, especially honeybees, are an important part of any working farm. They pollinate everything from papayas to cucumbers to coffee beans. And like cows or pigs or chickens, these buzzy little workers are considered livestock, cared for and managed by farmers and beekeepers so that you can have food on your plate. But unlike other livestock, there's one thing that farmers haven't been able to do for their bees: provide nutritious human-made feed when the flowers aren't blooming. Until now. Last month, scientists unveiled a new food source designed for livestock bee colonies. They say it could help bee survival rates around the world. Brandon Hopkins is the P.F. Thurber Endowed Distinguished Professor of Pollinator Ecology at Washington State University. He helped to run the trials for this new food, and he also co-authored a study on the food source. He joins us now to talk about it. Brandon, thank you for being here.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's great to talk to you about this exciting research.
So, what do honeybees eat? Like, don't they eat honey?
Yeah, they do eat honey, but they tend to they eat honey in the winter times or times of dearth. So the honey that they consume and that people know very well and love comes from the nectar of the flowers that they visit. And that provides the sugars, the carbohydrates that they require and that they store for these long periods when there aren't flowers available. But a big part of their nutritional needs comes from the pollen of flowers, and that's all their protein and amino acids and vitamins and lipids and sterols and all these like essential components that they need to raise the next generation of bees. So to feed all the young larvae that are in the colony and that keep the colony going for months or years on end.
If bee colonies depend on pollen, why would their food be scarce? Like if these are bees that are on a farm helping to pollinate crops, why wouldn't those crops provide the nutrition that the bees need?
That's a great question. And it's one of the most complex issues, I think, in beekeeping and is often cited as like one of the biggest causes of sort of colony losses here in the US and in other places around the world. It's great to imagine, and in some cases there are these, beautiful farms that have a diversity of floral resources or these beautiful open pastures, but those are more and more rare on the landscape these days. And so really modern farms and the vast majority of the landscape we have are either not suitable really for bees at all during a majority of the season, or just don't provide either just the sheer number of flowers or a good enough diversity of flowers in the landscape for the number of colonies that we have here.
I see. So these monoculture farms where you have like maybe a field of blueberries and then the bees are out pollinating the blueberries, but that's not a balanced diet for them.
Yeah, exactly. And honeybees have evolved to be generalists, and so they really require a diversity in the diet. So there's no real floral source that has all of the nutritional needs that bees require, and so they really need a diverse floral diet to be healthy.
But you have helped to create a new food source that seeks to be a comprehensive package of nutrition for these little guys. Can you tell us what this food actually is? Like, what does it look like? I mean, are there little buckets of pollen that you're putting in the hives?
Yeah, that's great. It's been a wonderful partnership with Apex Biosciences, who had spent years or decades, along with other researchers at other universities, kind of developing the science behind this diet to make sort of a truly complete replacement for pollen in the landscape. And what this looks like is, and I've now learned from my younger students here in the lab that this analogy was a little bit lost on them, but when I was growing up, we had these power bars that you would eat, before or after maybe a sporting event or something like that to get your energy up. And so, these types of protein bars that we eat as humans that are sort of soft protein or energy packed, squishy food type bars, it's a little bit like that. I can't think of another necessarily analogy, but it's a soft, slightly sweet, protein rich patty that goes in the hive.
Have you tasted them?
I have tasted them, yes.
How would you describe the taste?
Yeah, I would describe it as like a power bar, but like would not, I don't think, do very well on the human market. So, it's slightly sweet. But other than that, it's sort of, bready, maybe sort of yeasty flavored. Not something not my go-to snack in the middle of the day, but it's edible.
It doesn't taste floral.
It does not taste floral at all. That would make it better, I would think.
All right. So when you get one of these power bars, one of these like bee wafer things, and you pop it into the hive, can you explain like what happens next? How does the nutrition get to where it needs to go?
That's a great question. And so we just kind of put it in there, and the adult bees, and this is generally sort of this idea that bees, as they age, progress into different jobs throughout the colony that they need to perform to be successful. And so what we think is that in general, you have these nurse bees that would normally be going and eating stored pollen in the colony, to then use that nutrition to activate and stimulate the glands in the head of the bee to produce the secretions that then go to feed the larva. So those nurse bees then come and consume this pollen replacement diet that we provide in the colony. So they consume that and then convert those nutrients into some people call it bee bread or the royal jelly glandular secretions.
Bee bread. So, and that's something that these nurse bees are making inside their bodies with the fuel of the pollen.
The bee bread is what's often referred to as the stored pollen inside the comb. And so that's what they consume, and they convert it into royal jelly or the larval diet.
And so your wafer is kind of standing in for the bee bread a little bit.
Exactly, yeah. So it's a replacement for the bee bread, which, like we talked about earlier, is often in short supply, or it can sometimes be completely absent during the pollination of certain crops or at certain times a year, or in these harsher environments where there's a limited amount of pollen in the landscape, to the point where they consume everything they bring in immediately and never really get a chance to even store much in the way of pollen. And that can cause lots of downstream issues with the health of the colonies.
So why was it a hard problem to sort of figure out what the bees need to eat and what to put in the power bar?
That's a great question. It's because it's amazingly complex. And I think in some of these with these other livestock species, I think there's a bit more money or power sort of in those industries to support the research that's gone in to provide people and farmers with fully nutritionally complete diet. Even our dogs and cats, have this pelletized food that we feed them, and they can live their whole life and multiple generations as healthy animals. In honeybees, it's just taken us longer. I mean, it's a smaller industry, and so it's taken longer to develop this. And in some ways, I don't know if it's more complex, but it's a highly complex system, because you're not, like I said before, you're really feeding an adult bee a diet, and then they're converting that into a separate substance that's then feeding the larva. And so it's sort of highly complex to make sure that you're moving these micronutrients from the adult who's consuming the diet into the larva that consume a separate substance.
So what is in these things?
Yeah, and so that's the stuff where, you get to patented diet IP protection type stuff. So the truth is I don't fully know. One of the interesting things is from the publication that we had that we just published recently is that while some of these things like the sterols are make up, a 0.2% of the overall components of, say, the pollen replacement diet, they're critical for these colonies to be able to produce new generations of bees. So without this like very small micronutrient, the larvae fail to develop and become adult bees.
Oh, wow. So you have to figure out which of these little organic compounds and stuff like that matter and which ones are less important.
Right. And in this case, it often takes, again, sort of the complexity of this is that you can't just feed an adult and know whether or not that was an essential thing. You have to have multiple generations because if that micronutrient is missing in the diet, you don't know until, maybe 3, 4 generations are raised on nothing but that diet before that micronutrient like pops out as a problem and starts causing issues in development.
So we've talked about some of these colonies, crashing if they don't have enough nutrition, and this has obviously been a major issue across the country, across the world. We've been seeing, save the bees stickers and stamps and so on for years. So how are the bees doing? Do the bees still need saving?
They still need a lot of help. Bees in general need saving and need help. And so one thing that's important to differentiate is that, we've been talking about honeybees and they are, absolutely critical to agriculture and they're an amazing creature. But there are lots of other bees too, like native bees, solitary bees, bumblebees, all these other very cool bees. I don't know, more than 4,000 species in the U.S. And those bees don't have anybody tending to them or providing them special diets and moving them to better pastures and things like that. And so those bees and honeybees equally have a very, very hard time surviving in our modern landscape. And so it's still very, very tough time to be a bee. Whether you're a honeybee or a solitary bee, it's very, very difficult.
Yeah, and I know there's a lot of factors that sort of feed into that crisis for the bee population. Everything from insecticides and environmental chemicals to loss of habitat and human development and changes in agriculture and so on. So, how much do you think addressing this particular issue of nutrition scarcity could help the bees, and what difference might this new food source make for bee production?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think it's essential. It's really like the center point, I think, for helping bees. And whether that's, improving the landscape so there's natural forage or like this approach, which I'm very excited about because it's sort of a simpler approach or an approach that beekeepers can actually implement versus, trying to change modern farming practices or reduce urbanization. These are massive issues, right, that no individual beekeeper can impart change on. So in that way, it's, very applied and practical to be able to cause change. And I say it's really key because nutrition is essential, or it's a key aspect to addressing all the other complex issues affecting bees. So if you take pesticides, for example, it's well known that good nutrition, proper nutrition, healthy bees can overcome or resist pesticide pressures, right? So if you're starving and you get exposed to pesticides, you're probably dead meat. But if you have really good nutrition, you're very healthy, you might be impacted a bit by pesticides, but you can recover from that. And the same is true for these pests and pathogens. So it's well known that varroa mites and these viruses impact bees' health greatly. But it's been shown that if you have good nutrition, you're a very healthy colony, you can withstand greater viral pressures or withstand greater mite populations if you're healthy. So that nutrition is really central so that then they can survive these other pressures without a total colony loss.
Well, I know of one swarm that's going to be off the job for a little while. I wanted to ask you about this, even though it's a little bit off topic. On Friday, a semi-truck full of beehives bound for farms somewhere near the Canadian border turned over and released something like 250 million bees into the environment. And sheriff's deputies and others who arrived to try and help clean it up had to take cover to avoid being stung. What I'm wondering is what happens to those bees now? Are they going to be okay?
Yeah, unfortunately, they probably won't be okay, which is kind of sad. And so, in some cases, they are able to fix that situation. If they get to it while it's still dark or cold, and the boxes haven't been crushed or damaged too badly, sometimes they're able to stand that truck back up or get those colonies loaded onto a new truck and get them out of there. But oftentimes, especially on interstates or near cities, and if it's in the middle of the day, those bees immediately are flying up into the air, and they've got to get that under control for traffic and human safety reasons. And so oftentimes those colonies have to be sort of immediately taken care of in terms of
fumigated,
soapy water, and the colonies kind of have to be destroyed.
Oh, what a bummer.
Get the mess cleaned up. So it's kind of a sad deal, and it happens from time to time. And I don't know if we, connecting this back to what we're talking about is that, and what people often don't know is that part of moving colonies is a major requirement to meet the pollination demands in this country. So California requires more than 2 million colonies, which is 80 or 90% of every commercial colony in the country has to be trucked to California to pollinate almonds. And then those 2 million colonies, they have to be trucked out of California to the next crops across the U.S. And oftentimes they're trucked around like that 6 or 7 times throughout the season to pollinate the vast, number of different crops that they contribute to.
Wow. That's a reminder of this kind of silent workforce that is a crucial link in our food supply. Is there anything, Brandon, that we didn't mention that you think is important to include in this conversation?
Yeah, it had me thinking again with this turned over truck, the thing that having a complete diet like this for bees might also help take some additional burden off of the landscape. And what made me think of it was this truck turning over is that not only do we have to move bees around by the semi-load like this for pollination purposes, but we as beekeepers, have to move bees around in the landscape like that, also just to spread them out when they're not in pollination. So you can't take the 10,000 colonies you own when you're done with pollination, and now it's say August, and just put them in the same parking lot or something, right? So now you got to take those 10,000 and spread them into hundreds of locations across the landscape.
In order for them to have enough forage to get the nutrition that they need.
Exactly. And so that's not only difficult, on the bees and the beekeeper, but it's also a strain on the ecosystem. So all those solitary bees that live out there in these locations, then, in some ways, and this is a little bit controversial, but you can imagine that they might be competing in some circumstances for resources with those honeybees. And so if we were able to have a complete diet where we could maintain larger, greater densities of these honeybee colonies, not be forced to spread them out so widely across the landscape, because we had a truly complete nutritional diet, it would benefit the ecosystems, and it would benefit the beekeepers, and it would, be a great help, I think, for the whole system.
We don't need to go out. We have power bars at home.
That's right, yeah.
Brandon Hopkins is a professor of pollinator ecology at Washington State University, and he's co-author of a study on bee food published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society Bee last month. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been great talking with you.
Thanks for listening to Sound Side. By the way, this show is only possible because listeners support us. If you are able to give right now, check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.